Welcome to the quiet world of dreams.
Two ships lost beneath the Arctic ice. Unsolved historical mysteries. Tonight, as you settle into a comfortable position, imagine that you are standing inside the lower deck of a wooden ship. Outside, there is no open sea. There is only ice. It presses against the hull from every direction, stretching far beyond anything you can see. The Arctic night has settled over the landscape, and the sun will not return for many weeks. Above you, the wind moves across the frozen surface. Inside the ship, the timbers contract in the cold. Iron fittings shift. Somewhere in the darkness, a metal plate gives a low, tired groan. You are aboard HMS Erebus, or perhaps her companion, HMS Terror. Both ships have been trapped for more than a year. Oil lamps cast a weak yellow light across the beams. The air smells of coal smoke, damp wool, salted meat, and men living too closely together. Beyond the walls, the temperature is falling. There are no towns nearby, no roads, and no safe harbor within reach. Only the ice, the dark, and the slow passage of time. The men aboard these ships had left England as members of one of the best-equipped Arctic expeditions ever assembled. They carried years of provisions. They had experienced officers, reinforced hulls, steam engines, scientific instruments, books, heating systems, and the confidence of the most powerful navy in the world. Yet none of the 129 men would return home. For many years, almost everything that happened after the ships entered the Arctic remained unknown. A few graves were found. A single written message survived. Inuit witnesses preserved accounts of exhausted strangers moving south across the frozen land. Later searches discovered abandoned equipment, scattered bones and marks that revealed the final stages of a human tragedy. Much more recently, the two lost ships themselves were found beneath Arctic waters. And still, the Franklin expedition has never surrendered all of its secrets. So tonight, we will follow Erebus and Terror from the crowded docks of Victorian England to their last known position in the ice. We will look carefully at what is documented, what modern science can reasonably suggest, and what remains uncertain. There is no need to hurry. The ships have been waiting beneath the water for a very long time. We can approach them slowly. In the early 19th century, large areas of the world had already been mapped by European naval powers. Coastlines had been measured. Trade routes crossed the Atlantic, the Indian Ocean, and the Pacific. Naval charts grew more detailed with each voyage. But the northern edge of North America remained difficult to understand. For centuries, European navigators had searched for a sea route connecting the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans through the islands and channels of the Canadian Arctic. This hypothetical route became known as the Northwest Passage. If such a passage could be found and navigated reliably, ships traveling between Europe and Asia might avoid the long journey around Africa or South America. The idea was commercially attractive. It was also dangerous. The Arctic was not an empty white space waiting to be crossed. Inuit communities had lived in this environment for generations, developing knowledge, clothing, travel methods, hunting practices, and social structures suited to the region. European expeditions, by contrast, usually arrived with ships and systems designed elsewhere. Their crews often depended on stored provisions and naval routines that were difficult to maintain far from supply ports. Some adapted successfully, others did not. By the 1840s, British expeditions had charted much of the Arctic coastline. Only a relatively small portion of the possible route remained uncertain. The British Admiralty believed that one final, well-equipped expedition might complete the map. The command was given to Sir John Franklin. Franklin was 59 years old when the expedition departed. He was an experienced naval officer and Arctic traveler. His earlier overland expeditions had included severe hunger, difficult retreats, and the deaths of several men. To the British public, however, Franklin represented endurance, duty, and respectable leadership. He was not traveling alone. HMS Erebus was commanded by Captain James Fitzjames. HMS Terror was commanded by Captain Francis Crozier, one of the most experienced polar navigators in the Royal Navy. Crozier had already sailed in both Arctic and Antarctic waters. He understood ice, magnetic observation, and the long psychological pressure of polar winters. The ships also had their own histories. Erebus and Terror had originally been built as bomb vessels. Their hulls were designed to withstand the recoil of heavy mortars and were therefore unusually strong. Before Franklin's expedition, both ships had sailed to Antarctica under James Clark Ross. Mount Erebus and Mount Terror on Ross Island still carry their names. For the new voyage, the ships were reinforced again. Their bows were strengthened with timber and iron. Small steam engines, adapted from railway locomotives, were installed to drive propellers when wind conditions were poor. The vessels carried heating systems, desalination equipment, scientific instruments, and libraries containing hundreds of books. They also carried a large quantity of preserved food. Thousands of tins had been prepared under a government contract. There was salted meat, soup, vegetables, flour, tea, chocolate, lemon juice, spirits, and other provisions intended to sustain the crews for several years. From the outside, the expedition appeared to have anticipated almost every practical need. Yet the Arctic often exposes the difference between being well supplied and being truly prepared. On the morning of May 19th, 1845, Erebus and Terror left Greenhithe on the River Thames. Friends and relatives watched from the shore. The ships moved slowly downstream, their decks crowded with men, equipment, rigging, and stored supplies. Steam and smoke drifted into the damp English air. Franklin's wife, Jane, remained behind. Like many naval families, she was accustomed to long separations. A voyage of several years was not unusual. Letters might arrive months late, or not at all. At first, there was no reason to believe that this farewell would be permanent. The expedition stopped at Stromness in the Orkney Islands, then continued toward Greenland. At Disco Bay, supplies were transferred from a transport ship. 5 men were sent home, reducing the expedition to 129 officers and crew. Letters written during this period suggest confidence. The men repaired equipment, reorganized stores, and prepared for the more isolated stage of the voyage. In late July 1845, 2 whaling ships encountered Erebus and Terror in Baffin Bay. The Franklin ships were waiting for favorable conditions before entering Lancaster Sound. The crews exchanged signals and observations. Then the expedition continued west. These were the last Europeans known to have seen Franklin and his men alive. The ships passed slowly beyond the familiar edge of communication. Behind them lay the Atlantic routes that could still carry a letter home. Ahead lay channels of water, drifting ice, low islands, and the approaching winter. The expedition spent its first Arctic winter at Beechey Island. The location was not known in Britain at the time, but later searchers found clear evidence of a winter camp there. The men had constructed workshops and storage areas on shore. They had maintained their equipment and carried out scientific observations. The remains of hundreds of food tins were eventually discovered, along with other traces of organized naval life. Most importantly, searchers found 3 graves. The first belonged to John Torrington, a 20-year-old stoker aboard Terror, who died on January 1st, 1846. The second belonged to John Hartnell, an able seaman from Erebus who died 3 days later. The third belonged to William Brain, a Royal Marine, who died in April. Their graves were carefully prepared. Each was marked with a wooden headboard. 3 deaths during a first Arctic winter were serious, but not necessarily evidence of a collapsing expedition. Illness was common aboard 19th century ships, and the expedition still had most of its crew. When the ice loosened during the summer of 1846, Erebus and Terror continued south through Peel Sound. This decision carried them into a region where ice conditions could be extremely unpredictable. The ships eventually reached the waters northwest of King William Island. There, in September 1846, the ice closed around them. A wooden ship caught in pack ice does not remain in a quiet, fixed landscape. The ice moves. Large fields drift with wind and current. Pressure builds along their edges. Ridges rise where one sheet is forced over another. Open water can appear and close again within hours. A ship may be carried far from the position where it first became trapped. It may also be squeezed. Erebus and Terror had reinforced hulls, but even strong timbers could be tested by the gradual pressure of an entire frozen sea. The crews prepared for another winter. Canvas awnings may have been stretched over parts of the decks. Snow could be banked against exposed sections for insulation. Heating pipes carried warmth through parts of the interior. Life would have followed a carefully maintained routine. Meals were served at appointed times. Officers recorded observations. Sailors repaired clothing and equipment. Men read books, attended religious services, performed theatrical entertainments, or walked on the ice when conditions allowed. Routine was not merely tradition. It was a defense against darkness and uncertainty. Outside, the sun disappeared. Inside, lamps burned through long hours. Condensation gathered on cold surfaces. Damp clothing dried slowly. Coal smoke and human breath thickened the air. The hulls creaked as the temperature changed. Men sleeping in hammocks would have heard every movement of the ship. The first winter in the ice passed. Then the summer of 1847 arrived. But the ships did not break free. The ice remained around King William Island. At some point during this second trapped year, Sir John Franklin died. The surviving written record gives the date as June 11th, 1847. It does not tell us how he died. Franklin was 61 years old and had endured 2 Arctic winters. His death may have resulted from illness, cardiovascular disease, infection, nutritional deficiency, or a combination of factors. Any more precise diagnosis would be speculation. Command of the expedition passed to Francis Crozier, with James Fitzjames as the next senior officer. The men waited through another summer. Open water may have appeared in the distance. Leads may have formed between moving sheets of ice. Yet the ships remained trapped. The sun began to sink again. A third winter was approaching. For many months, the expedition left behind no known written account of its worsening condition. Then, in April 1848, Crozier and Fitzjames added a message to a printed Admiralty form and placed it inside a stone cairn on King William Island. This document is now known as the Victory Point Note. It is the most important written record recovered from the expedition. The first message on the paper had been written in May 1847. At that time, it stated that all was well. The ships had wintered at Beechey Island and had been trapped in the ice since September 1846. Almost a year later, officers returned to the same document and wrote a second message around its margins. The tone had changed completely. Franklin was dead. The ships had been abandoned on April 22nd, 1848. By then, 9 officers and 15 men had died. The 105 survivors planned to begin walking south toward the Back River, which is now more commonly known as the Great Fish River. The note was signed by Crozier and Fitzjames. It remains the only known written statement describing the decision to leave the ships and attempt an overland retreat. Try to imagine that decision without rushing past it. For 19 months, the ships had been held in the ice. They were shelter, storage, warmth, identity, and the last physical connection to home. Leaving them meant stepping onto the frozen sea with no certainty that a rescue party was nearby. The men faced a journey of hundreds of kilometers across rough ice, exposed coastline, river systems, and tundra. Many were already ill or weakened. Their destination was not a town. Reaching the Back River would only bring them to another difficult route toward distant trading posts. Still, remaining aboard the ships may have appeared equally hopeless. Food quality may have deteriorated. Fuel was finite. Disease could spread easily in close quarters. The ice had failed to release the ships during 2 summers. The survivors lowered boats onto heavy sledges and loaded them with supplies. Later, searchers would find evidence of what they carried. Some objects were practical: clothing, food, guns, ammunition, boots, and navigation equipment. Others seemed less suited to an emergency retreat, including books, personal possessions, and pieces of tableware. Victorian commentators sometimes treated these objects as evidence that naval discipline had become irrational. That interpretation may be too simple. A silver spoon or a personal book did not weigh enough to destroy an expedition by itself. Some objects may have been chosen for trade, repair, signaling, or emotional value. Others may have remained in the boats because plans changed or because men died before unnecessary items could be discarded. We should be cautious when judging decisions made by people who were exhausted, grieving, hungry, and uncertain of the future. On April 26, 1848, according to the Victory Point Note, the surviving men began their journey south. The landscape ahead was almost entirely without shelter. The surface beneath them was not a smooth white road. It was a broken field of ridges, pressure blocks, frozen pools, stones, and deep snow. Each loaded sledge had to be pulled by men whose strength was already declining. Progress may have been painfully slow. A group might drag a boat forward for part of the day, unload it, move the supplies separately, then return for what had been left behind. Boots grew wet. Leather stiffened. Snow glare strained the eyes. At night, the men would need to create some form of camp, prepare food, care for the sick, and attempt to sleep while the cold moved through their clothing. The expedition now began to disappear into smaller fragments. There is no complete record of who traveled together, how quickly they moved, or where individual men died. Some may have returned to the ships. Inuit testimony later suggested that at least one ship had been seen after the official abandonment, possibly with people still aboard. The positions of the wrecks also show that the vessels moved considerable distances after April 1848, whether carried by drifting ice, handled by surviving crewmen, or through some combination of both. This remains one of the central uncertainties in the story. The Victory Point note describes a single plan. The archaeological evidence suggests that what followed may have been much less orderly. Back in Britain, no one yet knew that the ships had been abandoned. At first, silence was expected. Arctic expeditions could remain away for years. Franklin's ships carried extensive provisions, and the Admiralty believed that they might simply be delayed. By 1847, however, concern was growing. Jane Franklin urged the government to act. Naval officers, private sponsors, and foreign searchers began organizing expeditions. In 1848, the first major searches departed. They found no living crew. Over the following decades, the search for Franklin became one of the largest and most persistent rescue efforts of the 19th century. Ships entered the Arctic from east and west. Sledge parties crossed islands and coastlines. Searchers mapped large areas while looking for cairns, messages, wreckage, and graves. The search itself helped chart much of the Canadian Arctic, but the missing men remained beyond reach. In 1850, searchers found the winter camp and 3 graves at Beechey Island. This proved that Franklin had survived the expedition's first year. It offered little information about what happened next. Then, in 1854, the Scottish explorer and surveyor John Ray returned with disturbing reports. Ray had spoken with Inuit people who described encountering a group of approximately 40 white men traveling south several years earlier. The strangers had appeared exhausted and short of food. Other Inuit accounts described bodies found later, along with objects belonging to the expedition. Ray reported that some of the remains showed signs that the final survivors had resorted to cannibalism. Victorian Britain reacted with outrage. Many refused to believe that Royal Navy officers and sailors could have crossed such a boundary. Charles Dickens publicly attacked the credibility of the Inuit testimony and defended the moral character of Franklin's men. His argument reflected the prejudices of his time. Inuit witnesses were treated as unreliable, even though they understood the region, had directly observed important evidence, and later provided information that helped locate both wrecks. The idea of cannibalism threatened the heroic image forming around Franklin. It transformed the expedition from a story of noble disappearance into a more difficult account of physical collapse. For decades, the subject remained controversial, yet the Arctic continued to preserve evidence. In 1859, a search expedition led by Francis Leopold McClintock found the Victory Point note. McClintock's men also discovered a ship's boat resting on a heavy sledge. Inside and around it were human remains and a collection of equipment. The boat was pointed generally back toward the north rather than south toward the river. This has led to many interpretations. Perhaps the men were returning to the ships. Perhaps the boat had been repositioned. Perhaps the orientation resulted from local conditions rather than a final intended direction. The evidence does not allow certainty. Elsewhere on King William Island and along the southern routes, searchers found bones, clothing, buttons, paper fragments, tools, and personal objects. Each discovery marked a place where someone had stopped. Sometimes it was possible to identify a name. Usually it was not. The men who left England as an organized naval expedition had become scattered across a vast landscape. More than a century later, modern scientific investigation returned to the Franklin sites. In the 1980s, researchers exhumed the 3 men buried at Beechey Island. The permanently frozen ground had preserved their bodies to an extraordinary degree. John Torrington, John Hartnell, and William Brain could be examined using modern medical and forensic methods. Their faces, clothing, hair, and hands had survived beneath the ice. The examinations suggested serious illness. Evidence indicated that pneumonia was likely involved in the deaths of Torrington and Hartnell. Tuberculosis may also have affected some members of the expedition, although the exact medical history of each man cannot be reconstructed with complete confidence. Researchers also found high concentrations of lead in tissues and bone. This led to one of the most familiar explanations of the Franklin disaster. According to the theory, poorly sorted food tins exposed the crew to dangerous levels of lead. Lead poisoning might have caused abdominal pain, weakness, confusion, neurological symptoms, and impaired judgment. The tins discovered at Beechey Island did contain thick and sometimes untidy lead solder. For a time, this seemed to offer a simple answer. The expedition had carried a technological innovation in the form of preserved food, and that innovation had poisoned the men it was intended to protect. But later research complicated the picture. High lead levels do not, by themselves, reveal exactly when exposure occurred. 19th century people encountered lead through many sources, including water systems, plumbing, paint, medicines, food containers, and industrial environments. Some studies have suggested that the expedition's water system may have contributed to exposure. Other analyses of bones, teeth, and fingernails have questioned whether lead levels rose sharply during the voyage or whether they were already elevated before departure. Research on John Hartnell's fingernail suggested that severe zinc deficiency may have played a significant role in his declining health, while lead may not have been the sudden and universal cause once proposed. The most responsible conclusion is therefore limited. Members of the expedition were exposed to lead, and that exposure may have weakened some of them or worsened existing problems. But the available evidence does not prove that lead poisoning alone caused the disaster. There was probably no single cause. Scurvy is another likely factor. Humans require vitamin C, and long periods without sufficient fresh food can lead to weakness, painful joints, bleeding gums, poor wound healing, and eventually death. The expedition carried lemon juice as an anti-scorbutic. However, prolonged storage and processing could reduce its effectiveness. Whether every survivor suffered from severe scurvy is unknown, but nutritional deficiency almost certainly became more important as the expedition continued. Starvation followed. Stored provisions could sustain men only while supplies remained accessible and edible. Hunting in the Arctic required knowledge, mobility, suitable tools, and physical strength. The crews had firearms, but they did not possess generations of Inuit experience in finding food within this landscape. As the men weakened, obtaining and transporting food would have become even more difficult. Cold placed a constant demand on the body. A person exposed to Arctic temperatures needs substantial energy merely to maintain body heat. Wet clothing, exhaustion, illness, and inadequate shelter increased the risk of hypothermia. The men pulling sledges were spending energy at a time when their ability to replace it was disappearing. Infection, respiratory illness, nutritional deficiency, lead exposure, cold, hunger, and psychological strain did not act independently. They reinforced one another. A minor wound became harder to heal. A short march required more effort. A decision became more difficult. A man who fell behind could not easily recover. This combined explanation is less dramatic than a single hidden poison. It is also more consistent with the evidence. The Franklin expedition was probably not destroyed by one mistake. It was worn down by a connected series of pressures that became increasingly impossible to escape. The evidence for cannibalism must also be approached carefully. It is not based only on 19th century rumor. In the 1990s, forensic examination of human remains recovered from sites on King William Island identified cut marks consistent with the removal of flesh. Later research found fractures and surface changes indicating that some bones had been processed after death, possibly to obtain marrow. These findings support John Ray's report that at least some of the final survivors resorted to consuming the bodies of men who had already died. They do not tell us who participated. They do not reveal how many people were involved. They do not prove that anyone was murdered for food. The evidence points to survival cannibalism among people in the final stages of starvation. One of the remains identified through modern DNA analysis belonged to Captain James Fitzjames, the commander of Erebus and one of the officers who signed the final message. His jawbone carried cut marks. The identification made the evidence deeply personal. Fitzjames was no longer only a name in a naval record. He had survived long enough to leave the ships, traveled with other men, died somewhere on King William Island, and had his remains handled by survivors who were themselves approaching death. It is easy to treat this detail as the darkest mystery of the expedition, but it may be better understood as evidence of desperation rather than moral failure. Starvation changes the body gradually. Strength declines. Thinking narrows. The body begins consuming its own reserves. People who would never imagine crossing a particular boundary may eventually face choices shaped by conditions far outside ordinary experience. The Franklin men had spent years inside a culture of hierarchy, discipline, ceremony, and Christian belief. By the final stages of the retreat, those structures may no longer have been enough to protect them from biological necessity. We should not turn their suffering into spectacle. The marks on the bones do not describe savagery. They describe the last efforts of dying people to remain alive. One question remained visible on every map. Where were Erebus and Terra? Searchers had located camps, graves, papers, and remains, but the ships themselves were missing. Inuit oral histories contain descriptions of a ship sinking near the western coast of the Adelaide Peninsula and another vessel farther north. For generations, these accounts were recorded, translated, debated, and sometimes undervalued. Modern searches increasingly recognize that the oral testimony was not a secondary decoration to the written record. It was essential evidence. In September 2014, a Parks Canada-led team located a wreck in shallow water near the Queen Maud Gulf. The ship was identified as HMS Erebus. Its hull rested upright on the seabed. Although damaged, much of the lower structure and many objects inside had survived. 2 years later, in September 2016, HMS Terra was found in Terra Bay, south of King William Island. The discovery surprised researchers. The ship was in remarkably good condition. It sat upright in deeper, colder water, with many hatches and windows closed. Its 3 masts were broken, but sections of the deck remained intact. The locations broadly supported Inuit knowledge that had guided the searches. Erebus was found in 2014 and Terra in 2016, more than 160 years after organized searches for the expedition began. The wrecks created new questions. Both ships were discovered far from the position recorded when they were abandoned in April 1848. Ice drift may explain much of this movement, but Inuit accounts suggesting that men later occupied or sailed one of the ships cannot be dismissed. It is possible that a group returned north and reboarded a vessel. They may have attempted to navigate it south when the ice loosened. No surviving document confirms this. For now, it remains a reasonable but unproven possibility. Underwater archaeologists have begun recovering and studying objects from Erebus while documenting the more intact interior of Terra. Among the discoveries are navigation instruments, dishes, personal possessions, bottles, weapons, footwear, writing materials, and parts of the ship's equipment. Cold water and darkness have preserved wooden structures that would have disappeared quickly in the warmer seas. Cabins remain. Cupboards remain. Drawers may still contain objects placed there by men who expected to use them again. The most intriguing possibility is that written records survive inside sealed areas. A ship's log, an officer's journal, or even fragments of paper could change our understanding of the expedition. But underwater archaeology in the Arctic is slow. The diving season is short. The wrecks must be treated carefully. Removing an object without recording its exact position can destroy part of its meaning. The site is also not simply a British naval grave. It is located within Inuit Nunangat and is jointly managed through collaboration between Inuit organizations and Parks Canada. The expedition entered a region already known, traveled, named, and understood by Inuit people. Its modern investigation increasingly reflects that reality. Parks Canada's continuing archaeological work treats the wrecks as a rare opportunity to study the expedition through preserved structures and artifacts in collaboration with Inuit partners. So what happened to Franklin's men? We can describe part of the story with confidence. Erebus and Terror sailed from England in May 1845 with 129 men. They spent the winter of 1845 to 1846 at Beechey Island, where 3 crewmen died. The ships became trapped northwest of King William Island in September 1846. Sir John Franklin died in June 1847. After a second summer failed to release the ships, the survivors endured a third winter. By April 1848, 24 men were dead. The remaining 105 abandoned the vessels and began moving south. No confirmed survivor reached a European settlement. Some of the men died along the western coast of King William Island. Others reached areas farther south. At least some practiced survival cannibalism after members of their group had died. Both ships eventually sank south of their last recorded position. That is the documented frame. Inside it are many unanswered questions. Why did mortality increase so severely? How much food remained when the ships were abandoned? Was the stored food spoiled, contaminated, or simply insufficient after 3 years? How important were lead exposure, scurvy, tuberculosis, pneumonia, zinc deficiency, and other illnesses? Did discipline remain intact during the march? Did smaller groups separate from the main party? Who returned to the ships? Was Terror deliberately sailed into the bay where it was found? How long did the final survivors live? And did any of them leave a written account that still waits inside a dark cabin beneath the water? There are theories, but no complete sequence. The most realistic explanation is not a sudden catastrophe. It is a slow reduction of possibilities. First, the ships lose movement. Then communication disappears. The expected summer opening does not arrive. Men become ill. The commander dies. Another winter consumes fuel and provisions. The ships are abandoned. The retreat advances too slowly. Equipment is discarded. Groups become smaller. The landscape grows quieter. Finally, there is no one left to record what happens next. For many years, popular retellings presented the Franklin expedition as a contest between heroic British explorers and an empty, hostile wilderness. That version is incomplete. The Arctic was not empty. The expedition traveled through Inuit homelands while possessing only limited knowledge of how to live there. Inuit witnesses later saw the men, found their camps, recovered objects, and preserved accounts of the ships. Their testimony provided some of the earliest reliable evidence of the expedition's fate. It also helped modern searchers locate the wrecks. The failure was therefore not simply that the Arctic was impossible to survive. People already survived there. The Franklin expedition failed partly because naval technology, imported provisions, and institutional confidence could not fully replace local knowledge. The ships were among the strongest of their time. But strength in one environment does not guarantee survival in another. A reinforced hull could resist pressure. It could not create fresh food. A library could occupy the mine during winter. It could not teach a crew in a few months everything Inuit communities had learned across generations. A steam engine could move a ship through calm water. It could do very little when the sea itself became solid. The expedition carried the confidence of an empire that believed most geographical problems could be solved through preparation, discipline, and machinery. The Arctic did not respond to confidence. It followed wind, temperature, current, season, and ice. Slowly, the gap between the expedition's plans and the environment became too wide to cross. Now imagine returning once more to the interior of one of the ships. The lamps are no longer burning. The voices have faded. Water fills the passageways and rests against the cabin walls. A plate remains where it settled. A drawer stays closed. Fine sediment gathers across the floor. Outside, Arctic water moves slowly past the hull. For more than a century, the ships were described as lost, but they were never absent from the landscape. Inuit stories kept their memory close to the places where they sank. Bones remained on the shore. 3 young men rested beneath the frozen ground at Beechey Island. A folded naval form waited inside a cairn. And beneath the water, Erebus and Terror remained together in the wider region, though separated by distance and by the circumstances of their final journeys. The Franklin expedition is often called a mystery because we do not know every detail. Yet perhaps its meaning does not depend on discovering one final answer. Its history is a record of ambition, endurance, institutional certainty, cultural misunderstanding, and human vulnerability. It shows how a carefully planned enterprise can fail without a single moment of failure. It reminds us that documents preserve only a fraction of experience, and it asks us to listen carefully to forms of knowledge that earlier investigators were too willing to dismiss. Tonight, the Arctic is still moving around the wrecks. Winter ice forms and loosens. Water passes through openings in the timber. Archaeologists continue their patient work during the brief northern summers. Perhaps another object will be recovered. Perhaps a sealed space will be opened. Perhaps a few written lines will survive. Or perhaps the final days will remain beyond reconstruction, known only through distances, scattered objects, and marks left quietly on bone.